The sky above Cairngorm is the colour of cold ash. It is perhaps 4 in the morning. The stars have not yet gone, but they are fading over the high plateau, where the ground is flat and stone-covered and almost without soil. The wind moves across the summit field in a long, low breath. There is no tree up here, no shelter, nothing living but the grey-green lichen pressed flat against the quartzite. Below the plateau, the land begins to fall. The slopes come down steeply on the northern face, through scree and then heather into the valley of the Spey. On the southern face, the descent is different. It is longer, slower, and the land opens out into the wide strath of the Upper Dee. That valley is still dark. The river cannot be seen yet, but it can be heard. The Dee moves quickly here, close to its source, and the water runs over rounded granite and makes a sound that carries in the still air. The Dee rises on the plateau of the Cairngorm Massif, somewhere above 2,000 feet. By the time it reaches Bremer, it has already dropped considerably, and it moves with force through a narrow channel. The banks are thick with alder and birch. The birch trees are small and pale-trunked, and in the hour before dawn, they stand in loose groups on the hillsides like figures waiting. The alders grow right down to the water's edge, their roots gripping the gravel banks. Bremer itself sits in a hollow where the Cluny water joins the Dee from the south. The village is small. A few dozen stone-built houses, some of them thatched and some slated, follow the line of the road. The church stands a little apart, built of the same dark granite as everything else in this part of Aberdeenshire. In the morning darkness, the village is entirely quiet. No light shows yet in the windows. The smoke from last night's fires has long since gone cold. The granite here is different from the sandstone that builds so much of lowland Scotland. It is hard and grey with flecks of white feldspar, and it draws the cold in and holds it. A house wall of this granite in October will be cold to the touch by midnight and still cold at noon. The people who live behind these walls sleep under wool blankets and sheepskins. The floors are flagstone. The hearths are wide and burn peat cut from the high ground above the village. East of Bremer, the Dee widens a little and the valley opens. The road follows the north bank close to the water. It is not a wide road. 2 carts could pass each other with care, but not easily. The surface is compacted gravel and earth, rutted from summer traffic, and now beginning to harden with the first cold of autumn. The hills on either side rise to just over 3,000 feet. Lochnagar is to the southeast, its upper face hidden this morning in low cloud. The estate of Balmoral lies a few miles east of Bremer, on the south bank of the Dee. The old castle was demolished only a few years ago. The new castle, the one built for Victoria and Albert, was completed in 1856. Its pale granite tower can be made out in the grey pre-dawn light, rising above the Scots pines of the castle grounds. The pines are old, many of them, remnants of the Caledonian forest that once covered much of this country. They grow wide-spaced and tall, with bare reddish trunks and flat crowns. The smell in the valley at this hour is particular. There is cold water in it, and wet stone, and the faint resinous smell of pine bark. In autumn, there is also the smell of decaying heather and of the dark, peaty soil where the burns cut down through the hillsides. These burns are everywhere in this landscape. They come off the plateau in dozens, carrying the rainfall and snowmelt of the high ground. Some of them are named. The Quoich comes down from the north through a narrow gorge west of Bremer. The Calator runs in from the south, draining a long corrie below Tolmount. The corries themselves are a feature of this landscape that shapes everything. They are great curved hollows scooped from the upper faces of the hills by the glaciers of 10,000 years ago. In high summer, they hold the last patches of snow. In September, they are mostly brown and purple with heather and deer grass. At 4 in the morning in October, they are invisible, lost in the general darkness of the upper slopes. But the men who work this land know exactly where they are. They have names for all of them. The keepers and stalkers on the Balmoral estate are at work before light in the season. Deer stalking on this ground begins in September and runs through October. The men would have been out the previous afternoon, watching where the stags were lying, noting the wind direction, making a plan for the morning. They sleep in small stone cottages scattered across the estate. Some of these cottages are at the head of glens, miles from the road. The men who live in them know this country the way a person knows the interior of their own house. The deer on the Cairngorm Plateau in 1850 number in the thousands. The red deer here are large animals. The stags in October carry wide antlers and are heavy with the fat of the summer grazing. They move in herds across the high ground, coming down to lower elevations in the evening, returning upward before dawn. At 4 in the morning, a large herd might be moving across the flank of Bain, a buard, heading for the plateau. Their feet are quiet on the heather, but in a herd of any size, there is always the sound of occasional stones shifting and the low sound of breathing. The river at this hour is the most constant presence. Below Bremer, the Dee is perhaps 30 yards wide, running clear over a bed of granite boulders and gravel. The water is very cold. Even in August, it rarely warms much above 10 degrees, fed as it is by snowmelt from the plateau well into summer. By October, it is cold enough to numb a hand in moments. The salmon are in the river now. They have been running since spring, and by October, the large ones have moved well upstream. Fishing on the Dee in the 1850s is not the largely recreational pursuit it will later become. Some of it is. The riparian estates take income from letting the salmon beats, but much of the netting that takes fish from the lower and middle Dee is commercial work. The fish are taken in large numbers, packed in ice from the ice houses on the riverside estates, and sent south by cart and later by railway. The Deeside Railway reached Banchory in 1853 and Aboyne in 1859. For most of the 1850s, the fish still travel by road to Aberdeen. Aberdeen is 50 miles east. The road runs down Deeside through a succession of small settlements. Aboyne, Torfins, Glassell, Banchory, Bealdside. Each of these places in the 1850s is a cluster of farms and cottages, a church, perhaps a mill. The river is always close, usually visible from the road. The hills decrease in height as you move east. By the time the road reaches Bankery, the valley has opened considerably and the land is more agricultural. But the granite continues. It is everywhere in this part of Aberdeenshire, in the walls and the gateposts and the bridges and the floors of the steadings. A steading is the collection of farm buildings grouped around a yard. On a working farm in Deeside in the 1850s, the steading might include a barn for storing grain, a byre for wintering cattle, a stable for the horses, a cart shed, and perhaps a small bothy where farm servants sleep. The buildings are stone-walled under slate or thatch, set around a yard that is usually unpaved and in wet weather deeply muddy. The smell of such a yard in the morning is of dung and wet straw and horse breath. The farm workers on Deeside in the 1850s are tied to the farm by 6-month contracts. They are called farm servants, and they engage at hiring fairs held at Martinmas and Whitsunday in towns like Aboyne and Bankery. A ploughman in this period earns perhaps £7 or £8 for a 6-month term, along with his bothy accommodation and an allowance of oatmeal. The meal is a significant part of the wage. A man here eats oatmeal morning and evening, made into porridge with water, eaten from a wooden bowl. The oats grown on Deeside in the 1850s are a hardy variety suited to the short growing season and the cold. The fields are small, bounded by stone dikes or by low earth banks. On the better ground in the lower valley, the soil is a dark loam overlying gravel. On the higher croft land, it is thin and peaty and needs lime spread each year to keep it workable. The lime is brought up from the coast, burned in small kilns, and spread by hand from creels carried on the back. A creel is a large wicker basket, shaped to fit against the back, carried by a strap across the forehead or chest. It is the principal carrying device for people on this terrain in the 1850s. Peat is carried in creels, lime is carried in creels, fish are carried in creels on the backs of the women who walk from the coast to the inland markets. Those women, the fishwives from the villages around Aberdeen, walk as far as 20 miles inland with their loads. They walk in pairs or small groups. In the hour before dawn, they are already on the road. The roads in Deeside in the 1850s were largely the result of parliamentary road improvements made in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The main Deeside road was managed by a turnpike trust. There were toll bars at intervals, where carts and coaches paid a small charge. Pedestrians carrying loads on their backs generally paid nothing. The surface of the road was maintained by small gangs of roadmen who lived in cottages along the route and were responsible for a defined stretch. Their tools were hammers, rakes, and shovels. The granite chippings they used for repair came from roadside quarries. At Ballater, 8 miles east of Balmoral, the valley of the Dee makes a wide bend. The town of Ballater is a planned settlement laid out in a grid of streets in the late 18th century. In the 1850s, it has a modest hotel, a church, several small shops, and a community of perhaps 800 people. Many of them depend on the trade brought by visitors travelling to Deeside for the waters of Pannonish Wells, a mile to the east. Others work on the surrounding estates or in the small trades of a market town. The wells at Pannonish were said to have medicinal properties. People came from Aberdeen and further to drink the waters. There was a hotel beside the wells, built in the previous century, and by the 1850s, the trade in health tourism along Deeside was well established. The presence of the royal family at Balmoral from 1848 onwards brought further attention to the valley. Visitors came to breathe the air and walk the hills, and a small industry grew around, providing them with accommodation and guides and ponies. The ponies used on the hill are a local type. They are small, hardy animals descended from the native ponies of the Highlands. In the 1850s, they are used for carrying panniers of shot deer off the hill, for pulling small carts on farm tracks, and for carrying visitors who cannot or will not walk the steep ground. A garran, the local name for this type of pony, might carry the weight of a full-grown red deer stag, perhaps 16 or 17 stone of dead animal, strapped across its back on a wooden pack saddle. The pack saddle is made by the saddler in the nearest town. In this part of Deeside, that means ballater or breamer. A saddler in the 1850s works in leather and wood and iron, producing not only saddles but harness of all kinds, collar pads for the draft horses, and the heavy leather strapping used in farm work. His shop is a small stone building smelling of tanned hide and neatsfoot oil, with skins hanging from the ceiling and tools laid out on a wide wooden bench. The light is changing now. It is perhaps 4:30. The eastern sky above the Cairngorm plateau has shifted from black to a very deep blue. The plateau itself is still entirely dark. The wind has dropped slightly in the last hour, as it often does in this part of the night, just before the cold intensifies before dawn. On the high ground, the temperature is perhaps 2 degrees above freezing. On the valley floor at Bremer, it is a degree or two warmer, but not much. The frost that will come later in the season has not yet arrived in earnest, but the ground is cold, and the puddles in the road have a thin skin of ice by morning. The Dee below Bremer is showing the first signs of light on its surface. Not true light yet, but a slight lessening of darkness where the water moves. The river at this hour makes its own sound world. There is the continuous sound of the main current over the larger stones, a deep and steady noise. There is the higher sound of the shallows where the river spreads over gravel. There is the occasional sound of a large stone shifting in the current, a heavy knock. And there is the sound of the trees along the bank, the birch and the alder, beginning to move in the first breath of morning air. A grey heron is standing in the shallows on the north bank, just below where the Cluny meets the Dee. It has been standing there for an hour, motionless, watching the water. The salmon are not the only fish in this river. There are brown trout in the quieter reaches and eels in the deeper pools. The heron will take whatever comes within reach. It stands on one leg, its long neck folded, its pale eye open. In the village of Bremer, the first person to rise is likely the woman in the cottage nearest the church, the one with the large vegetable garden running down to the road. She rises at around 4:30 to start the fire. The fire in this cottage was banked last night, a large peat laid across the embers and covered with ash to keep the heat. She rakes the ash aside with an iron tool and lays fresh peat on the coals. The fire takes within a few minutes. The kitchen fills with the soft blue smoke of burning peat, and the smell of it is ancient and specific to this landscape. Peat smoke smells of the bog it came from, of compressed heather roots and old water and dark earth. The peat was cut in May on the hill above the village. It is cut in long rectangular blocks using a tool called a tuskar, a spade with a side wing that cuts and lifts the peat in one motion. The blocks are left in small stacks on the hillside through the summer months to dry. In September, they are brought down to the village and stacked beside each cottage in a great rectangular pile, enough to last the winter. A well-built peat stack, covered on the top with a layer of turf, will shed rain and keep its fuel dry through the worst weather. The stack against the gable of the cottage by the church is shoulder high and 4 yards long. It represents perhaps 3 months of warmth, no more. The sky above Bremer is still dark at 5:30 in the morning. The hills to the north hold the last of the night. A thin frost covers the grass along the banks of the Cluny water, and the birch trees on the lower slopes of Creag Choinish stand absolutely still. There is no wind yet. There will not be for another hour. A man named John Farquharson pulls on his boots near the door of a low stone cottage on the eastern edge of the village. The boots are heavy, made from stiffened cattle hide, and they have been resoled twice in the past 3 years. He laces them slowly. His fingers are cold. He eats before he goes. His wife has set out a bowl of brose made from oatmeal and cold water, stirred together and eaten without heat. This is common here in the 1850s. Brose is quick. It requires no fire that has not yet been lit. He eats it standing near the window. A small cup of buttermilk sits beside the bowl. He drinks it in 2 long swallows. He wears a coarse woolen jacket in a dark brown color. The wool was woven locally, likely at one of the small lint mills operating along the River Dee and its tributaries in this decade. His trousers are of the same material, cut loose below the knee. He wears a linen shirt beneath the jacket. The linen is not white. It has been washed many times in cold water and dried on heather. He wears a flat bonnet, the kind associated with this part of Scotland for well over a century, pulled low across his forehead. John Farquharson is a drystone diker. He works on the enclosures and field boundaries that are slowly extending across the lower slopes of the Cairngorms in this period. The improvement of agricultural land in Deeside is still ongoing in the 1850s, and drystone diking is one of the principal means by which moorland is being divided and managed. He will walk this morning approximately 2 miles northwest, up a track that runs from Bremer toward the open ground above Inverry. The track is rough. There are stones in it the size of a man's fist. He knows every one of them. His hands, when he lifts the bowl, are broad and cut across the knuckles. Stone-working leaves marks that do not heal between seasons. The inner skin of his palms is hardened. He carries a short-handled hammer and a selection of stone wedges in a canvas bag. He will build today, or continue building, a section of dike along a field edge that is perhaps 400 yards in total length. Progress is slow in cold weather. The stones are stiff with frost and must sometimes be cleaned of ice before they will sit properly. Further along the Dee Valley, at a settlement closer to Balmoral, another kind of worker is starting her morning. She is a woman in her late 30s. She is a knitter. In the 1850s, knitting in this part of Aberdeenshire and Upper Deeside is not a domestic hobby. It is a trade. Women in the Cairngorms region produce stockings, gloves, and caps that are sold through small dealers in towns like Balmoral and Aboyne, and from there reach markets further south. This woman, whose name might be Margaret or Christian or Margaretan, sits near the window of her cottage before full light comes. She knits by the first grey of the morning sky. She has eaten brose as well this morning. This is perhaps the most common breakfast in rural Deeside in the 1850s among working people. Oatmeal is cheap and fills the stomach. It is stored in a wooden gurnal, a meal chest, which sits in the corner of most cottages in this region. The gurnal in her house holds perhaps 2 or 3 months of oatmeal at a time, restocked from the nearest mill. The mill she uses is likely on a small burn nearby, one of the dozens of water-powered grain mills that operate across Deeside in this decade. She produces perhaps 1 pair of stockings every 2 days, depending on the complexity of the pattern. The wool she uses has often been spun locally, though some comes already prepared from dealers. She sells her work in small lots. The money is modest. It supplements what her household earns from other work, from croft land and seasonal labor. Her needles are made of steel wire. She capes them in a cloth roll. The tension of her knitting is even and practiced. She has been doing this since she was a child. Closer to Balmoral, in the valley of the Muick, and along the lower slopes where the new royal estate has been transforming the landscape since the late 1840s, a different kind of mourning is underway. The estate at Balmoral was purchased by the Crown in 1852, and work on the new castle began that same year. By the mid-1850s, there is considerable employment in the area related to the estate, from building work to forestry to gamekeeping. The men who rise at first light near Crathy and Balmoral are in some cases directly employed by the estate. A mason from Balmoral walks 5 miles to his work at the new castle this morning. He left the town of Balmoral at 5:20. He knows the road along the south side of the Dee. He has walked it for 2 years. He wears heavy woolen stockings inside his boots and a coat of a darker wool than his jacket, a greatcoat that reaches to mid-thigh. He carries his lunch in a cloth tied at the corners. Inside it, a piece of oatcake and a thick slice of cold boiled mutton. He will eat this around midday, sitting on a stone somewhere on the Balmoral site. He is one of several masons working on the construction of the new castle, which is being built in the Scots baronial style from grey granite quarried near Invergelde. The quarrying and cutting of this granite is itself a major source of employment in the 1850s. Granite is hard stone. It requires skilled hands and good tools to dress it into the shaped blocks that the building needs. The quarrymen at Invergelde work with iron wedges, long-handled hammers, and hand-operated cranes of timber and iron. The noise of it carries across the valley on still mornings. The castle being raised in these years is not a small project. It will replace an earlier and much smaller structure that had stood on the site. The new building involves dozens of workers over several seasons. Many of them live in temporary accommodation near the site or walk from Baleta, Crathy, and the villages along the lower Dee. The masons dress the stone on site before it is set. The dust from the granite settles on everything. North of the Dee, on the moorland that rises toward the Cairngorms proper, a different kind of work is beginning at first light on a clear morning in September of 1855. A gamekeeper from the estate at Mar Lodge is already on the hill before the sun clears the ridge of Bain, a Buard. His name is recorded in the estate records of the time, though not in detail. He wears a tweed jacket of a brownish-green color made locally from wool dyed with plants. He carries a percussion cap rifle, a single-shot weapon. He also carries a heavy leather bag for game. The bag is old. The stitching on one side has been repaired with a different thread. By the 1850s, deer stalking on the large Highland estates has become a significant activity, organized and managed in ways it had not been even 30 years earlier. Mar Lodge Estate, in the Upper Dee Valley near Bremer, employs several full-time keepers. They are responsible for the management of red deer on the hill, the control of predators, and the organization of stalking parties for paying guests. This is one of the trades of the Cairngorms in the 1850s. It does not look like a trade from the outside. But it is skilled, physically demanding work performed in poor weather at considerable altitude. He has eaten before leaving. A pot of porridge was made on the fire this morning, proper porridge cooked with water and a pinch of salt. This distinguishes his morning from the brose-eating workers of the lower valley. A fire was lit the night before and kept overnight. The cottage he lives in, on the edge of the Mar Lodge estate, is small and low. The walls are thick granite. The roof is heather thatch in the lower courses and turf above. It keeps the cold out reasonably well. He will walk today perhaps 8 miles in total, up to above 1,000 meters on the plateau. He carries a small flask of whiskey. This is not unusual. Whiskey distilling in the area has a long history, both legal and otherwise, and even after the reforms that brought many Highland distilleries into legal operation in the 1820s and 1830s, locally produced spirit remains common in the Upper Dee Valley. He will drink very little from the flask. It is for the cold at the top. Down in the valley, at the village of Baleta, a shoemaker has opened his workshop at 6 in the morning. The workshop is a single room at the front of a low building on the main street of the village. Baleta at this date is a small settlement, gaining some status as a stop on the route toward Balmoral and as a destination for visitors who come to take the mineral waters at Pananish Wells, a short distance to the east. The shoemaker is in his 40s. He has worked in the same room for 15 years. He makes and repairs boots and shoes for the local population and for estate workers. His tools hang on wooden pegs above the bench. There is a curved knife for cutting leather, an awl for piercing, needles of different thicknesses, and several wooden lasts of varying sizes. The lasts are shaped like feet. He fits the leather around them to create the form of the shoe before stitching. He sources his leather from a tanner who operates at a Boyne, some 14 miles to the east along the Dee. The leather arrives in cured flat sheets, rolled. He cuts what he needs. He has eaten this morning a bowl of oatmeal porridge and a cup of tea. Tea by the 1850s is a common drink in this region, even among working people, though it is not cheap. Sugar is used sparingly. He drinks the tea without sugar on most mornings. The cup is plain white pottery, made elsewhere and brought in by road. The Royal Deeside Road, which runs along the south bank of the Dee from Aberdeen westward through Aboyne, Baleta, and on toward Bremer, is the main artery of commerce and communication for this valley. Everything that is not made locally arrives by this road. In the small town of Bremer, a general merchant is preparing to open his shop on the morning of an early October day. The shop occupies the ground floor of a two-story building on the main road through the village. He sells oatmeal, barley, salt, dried herrings, coarse cloth, candles, tobacco, matches from the 1840s onward, and various ironwork items, nails, hinges, simple tools. He also holds a small stock of printed goods, almanacs, religious tracts, the occasional newspaper brought up from Aberdeen by carrier. The carrier service that connects Bremer to Aberdeen in the 1850s runs twice weekly in summer and weekly or less in winter. The road through Glen Shee on the southern approach to Bremer closes sometimes in hard winters for days at a time. The road along Deeside east to Baleta and Aboyne remains open more reliably. The merchant plans his stock accordingly. He keeps reserves of essential goods against the weeks when delivery is uncertain. He has been short of salt twice this past winter and oatmeal once. He wears a linen apron over his ordinary clothes. He has eaten bread this morning, baked the previous afternoon by his wife. The bread is made with barley flour, coarser than wheat bread, heavier in the mouths. Wheat flour is available and he sells it in the shop, but barley is grown locally in the lower parts of the valley and is considerably cheaper. The bread is dense and dark. It keeps for several days. In a cottage on the hill above Bremer, a woman is preparing to walk to the shieling. The word shieling in the 1850s in this region still refers to the seasonal pasture used for summer grazing, though the practice of moving entire households to the high ground is fading by this decade. What remains is the work of those who tend the cattle on the upper pasture during the late summer months. She carries a wooden pail. She will milk 2 cows on the hillside. The cows have been left on the upper ground since late August. The walk from the village to where they graze is perhaps a mile and a half uphill. She wears a heavy wool skirt in a dark colour reaching to her ankles. Over this, a linen apron. A shawl is wrapped twice around her shoulders and crossed at the front, held in place by a pin at the waist. She wears no gloves, though the morning is cold. She has eaten before leaving a cup of warm gruel made from fine oatmeal and water, thinner than porridge. She will carry the milk back down to the village in the pail, balanced on her head or carried in both hands depending on the paths. The path is steep in one section and muddy after the rain of the past 3 days. A ferryman on the River Dee near Invercold waits at first light beside his flat-bottomed boat. The Dee at this point is perhaps 40 yards across. The current in early October runs fast and brown with peat from the upper catchment. The ferryman has operated this crossing for 11 years. He charges a small fee for crossing. Most of his traffic is estate workers, traveling between the north and south banks of the valley. Occasionally, a visitor or a merchant uses the crossing rather than traveling the longer distance to the nearest bridge. The boat is made of larch planking, caulked with oakum and painted with linseed oil. It is fitted with 2 long oars and a pole for shallow water near the banks. The ferryman rows from the stern, turning the boat against the current to control the angle of crossing. In summer, this crossing takes a few minutes. In October, with the river running full, it takes longer. He keeps a careful watch on the water level. In November and December, some days the crossing is not possible at all. He eats his breakfast on the riverbank, sitting on a broad stone beside the landing. He has brought oatcake from the house, 2 thick pieces, and a small bottle of cold tea. He eats slowly. There is no one waiting to cross yet. The far bank is empty, birch trees bare of leaves along the waterline. A dipper moves along a stone in the middle of the current, dipping repeatedly. The ferryman does not look at it. He has looked at dippers on this river for 11 years. He finishes the oatcake and brushes the crumbs from his jacket. A mile to the east, in a small holding on the flats near the Dee, a crofter is preparing to cut the last of his turnip crop before the hard frost sets in. The turnips are grown in a field of perhaps half an acre, enclosed by a low dry stone dike. The field is one of 4 he works. The others carry the stubble of oats already harvested in September. He uses a simple bladed tool with a short handle for lifting the turnips. He cuts the tops and tails and piles the roots in rows. They will be stored in a pit dug into the earth and covered with straw and turf to keep them from freezing through the winter months. The light comes early in June across the high plateaus. By 4 in the morning, the sky above Brariach is already pale. The men are up before it. In the bothies along the upper Dee, the fire has been lit, the oatmeal set to simmer, and the boots pulled on in darkness. The Cairngorms in the 1850s are timber country. The Great Caledonian pine forest still holds much of the valley floor between Bremer and Ballater. It runs thick along both banks of the Dee, up the slopes of Morone and into the long glen of the Quoich. The trees are old. Some of them have stood since before the Jacobite risings. The foresters know each stand by name. The work begins at the tree. A team of 2 men takes a pit saw to the base of a mature Scots pine. The saw is a long 2-handled blade, roughly 5 feet in length. One man stands above on a raised platform of timber. The other stands below in the pit. They pull in alternation, 1 stroke down, 1 stroke up, keeping a steady rhythm. The sound carries in the still morning air. It is a low, rasping draw, back and forth, for as long as it takes to bring the tree down. The pine comes down slowly. There is a crack, then a long groan through the wood, then the fall. The impact shakes the ground. Smaller trees nearby shiver with it. The men step back and wait for the dust and the broken branches to settle before they move in again. Once the tree is down, the limbing begins. Axes are used here. The head of a felling axe in the 1850s is roughly 3 pounds of iron, set into a hickory haft perhaps 30 inches long. The woodsmen move along the fallen trunk, striking cleanly at each branch where it meets the bole. The rhythm is different now. Short, precise strokes. The sound is a clean chop, not a saw. The chips fly pale and resinous. The smell of cut pine is very strong. The bare trunk is then measured and marked. A rule is laid along the length. The markers score the wood with a chalk line. Specific lengths are required by the sawmill at Balmoral. The timber must be cut to suit the saws and the orders already placed. Nothing is wasted without good reason. Rolling the logs to the water is the next task. The Dee is the highway. This is how the timber moves. The men use long iron-tipped poles called peavies, or in some places simply pike poles. They are perhaps 8 feet in length, with a hooked iron point at the end. The men lever the logs down the slope to the riverbank. On steep ground, a simple wooden chute is sometimes laid. The log rides down under its own weight. The Dee at Bremer runs fast in spring and early summer. The snowmelt from the high tops keeps it full and swift. The loggers use this. A timber float is not a complicated thing. The logs are simply pushed into the current and allowed to go. Men walk the banks alongside. They carry their poles. Where the river bends sharp, they push the logs clear of the gravel bars that build up on the inside of each curve. At certain points along the river, the logs are gathered. There are booms, which are lines of chained timber laid across the water to catch the floating logs and hold them in a pool. One such holding point is near the confluence of the Cluny Water and the Dee, just below the town of Bremer itself. The logs spin slowly in the eddy behind the boom. The men count them and sort them by size. The river journey from Bremer to Balmoral covers roughly 17 miles. The valley narrows and widens in turns. At the Linn of Dee, 7 miles upstream from Bremer, the river runs through a gorge only a few feet wide in places. The logs do not go this way. They are cut from the forests east of the Linn, below that gorge, where the valley opens out and the river is workable. Baleta in the 1850s is a modest town. It has a market square, a handful of stone-built shops, and a bridge that crosses the Dee to the south bank. The sawmill sits close to the river. It is driven by a mill race, a channel of water diverted from the Dee upstream and brought to the mill wheel under controlled pressure. The wheel is overshot, meaning the water falls onto the top of the wheel and drives it down by weight. It turns slowly but with great force. The mill at Baleta converts the rough logs into planks and beams. Inside, the main saw is a frame saw, sometimes called a gate saw. It consists of a rectangular iron frame carrying one or more vertical blades. The frame moves up and down, driven by a crank connected to the wheel. The log is fed into the blades on a sliding carriage. The sawyer controls the feed rate with a ratchet mechanism. Each stroke of the frame cuts a little deeper. The planks fall away one by one. The noise inside a water-powered sawmill is considerable. The wheel turns with a steady rumble and a splashing. The saw frame clacks up and down. The blade hisses through the wood. The sawdust falls in pale drifts and settles on every surface. The smell is of wet pine and iron and machine oil. The floor is always damp. The men who work inside the mill are quieter than the loggers. They watch the blades. They listen for changes in the pitch of the saw that might mean the wood is harder than expected, or that a nail has been left in a log by accident. The finished planks are stacked outside on the mill yard. They are separated by thin wooden strips called stickers, which hold each layer apart to allow the air to circulate. The wood must dry before it can be sold or moved. Green timber, which is timber still heavy with sap, warps and splits as it dries. The proper seasoning of pine takes months. The yard at Baleta holds considerable quantities of timber at any one time. From Baleta, the planks travel south and east. In the 1850s, the railway has not yet reached Baleta. The Deeside railway line reaches Aboyne by 1859, but Baleta itself does not get its station until 1866. Through much of the decade, the timber travels by road. Heavy wagons pulled by Clydesdale horses carry the planks down the valley road toward Aboyne and Banchory, and from there toward Aberdeen. The road is the old military road in parts, built after the Rising of 1745, improved since then, but still rough by lowland standards. The wagons are wide-wheeled to avoid cutting too deeply into the gravel surface. Each horse is large, perhaps 17 hands, deep-chested, with heavy feathered legs. They pull in pairs or sometimes teams of 4 on the steeper gradients. The driver sits on the wagon or walks alongside. The journey to Aberdeen from Baleta takes most of a day. Aberdeen is where the timber is sold in bulk. The harbour on the River Dee at Aberdeen is a working port. In the 1850s, it handles timber from Scandinavia as well as from the inland forests of Deeside. The timber yards line the quays. There is the Inches, the low ground near the river mouth, and the quays of the Trinity and Regent areas. The smell of pine resin mixes with salt air and coal smoke. This is a different world from the forest. Back in the hills, the work continues through the long summer days. The pace is set by the light. The men are in the forest by 5 and working until the light goes. In midsummer at this latitude, that means work until 9 in the evening or later. The body adjusts to it. The muscles ache in the same places every day and eventually stop protesting. The diet of the timber workers is simple. Oatmeal is the foundation. Porridge in the morning, brose at midday. Brose is oatmeal mixed with cold water or cold stock, eaten without cooking. It takes no time to prepare and gives considerable energy. In the evening, there might be broth made with kale or turnip, with barley in the pot. Bread is less common here than in the lowlands. Oatcakes are baked on a flat iron griddle and kept for the working day. The bothies where the men sleep are low stone buildings. The walls are thick. The roof is turf or slate depending on where the bothy stands. There is one room, sometimes two. The floor is stone or beaten earth. The fire burns in the center of the room or against one wall. There is no chimney in the oldest buildings, only a hole in the roof. The smoke rises and drifts. The men sleep on heather beds or straw pallets along the walls. They share blankets. In summer it is tolerable. In winter it is hard. The summer grazing also brings people up into the high ground. The shealing system still operates in parts of the Cairngorms in the 1850s, though it is in decline. Families send their cattle and sheep up to the high pastures in June. The women and young people go with them. The shealings are small stone shelters. They stand in the upper glens, beside burns, on flat ground just below the head walls. Some of the shealing sites in Glen and Glen Cluny have been in use for centuries. The women at the shealings milk the cattle morning and evening. They make butter and soft cheese. The milk is rich in summer because the Highland grazings are full of variety. Fine grasses, clover, herbs, and heather tips all contribute to the flavor. The butter is churned in a simple plunge churn, a wooden barrel with a dasher worked up and down on a long handle. The butter is salted and packed into wooden kegs. The sheep are on the higher slopes. In the Cairngorms, the black-faced sheep had been displacing the older small breeds across the preceding century. They are hardy animals. They need little tending in good weather. The shepherd walks his ground in the early morning and again before dark. He carries a crook, a long wooden staff with an iron hook at the top for catching sheep by the leg. A dog works with him. The dog is essential. Without it, a single man could not move sheep across difficult ground at all. On the grouse moors to the east, August brings a different kind of activity. The glorious 12th, the 12th of August, is the opening of the grouse season. In the 1850s, this is already a significant date on the calendars of the landed estates. Balmoral is close. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert have been coming to Deeside since 1848. The royal presence has intensified the already considerable interest of wealthy sportsmen in the area. The gillies are out from before dawn on the 12th. They are the men who manage the shoot. They know the ground. They have spent the preceding weeks counting the birds and checking the heather. Heather burning, which opens up the old woody growth and encourages new shoots, is done in spring under specific weather conditions. The new growth provides the cover and the food that the grouse need to thrive. The grouse shooter in the 1850s uses a muzzle-loading percussion shotgun for much of the decade. The breechloader begins to become common toward the end of the 1850s and into the 1860s. The percussion gun requires powder and shot to be loaded from the muzzle before each shot. The rate of fire is slow. 2 shots, then a pause to reload. The gillie carries the powder horn and the shot bag. He also carries the game bag, which is a large leather or canvas bag worn over the shoulder. The walk-tup method is common in the early part of the decade. The guns, the gillies, and the dogs walk in line across the heather, flushing the birds as they go. The dogs used for this are pointers and setters. They range ahead and freeze when they scent a bird, indicating its position to the approaching line. The birds rise in a flurry of wings. The guns fire. The dogs retrieve the fallen birds. The driven grouse shoot, where beaters push the birds toward waiting guns, is also practiced by this period. The beaters are local men, sometimes boys. They are paid a day wage. They walk in a long line through the heather, striking it with sticks and waving flags to drive the birds forward. The grouse fly fast and low over the guns. It requires considerable skill to hit them. The guns stand in butts, which are low stone or turf walls built into the hillside. The number of birds shot in a day can be very large. Records from several Deeside estates show bags of several hundred brace in a single day by mid-century. The birds are packed into hampers with heather and sent south by coach and later by rail. There is a market for grouse in London and in the cities of central Scotland. The season is short. The trade is brisk while it lasts. The estates themselves are large. Glen Tanner, Glen Muick, and the lands around Lochnagar cover many thousands of acres each. The management of these estates employs a considerable number of people. Keepers, underkeepers, stalkers, gillies, foresters, and gardeners all work within the estate structure. There are also domestic servants at the big houses. Balmoral Castle itself is being rebuilt in this period. The old castle is demolished and the new granite building is completed in 1856. The granite comes from the local quarries. Crathy Quarry provides much of the stone. The quarrymen work with iron chisels and heavy hammers to split the granite along its natural grain. This splitting, called feathering and wedging, involves drilling a line of small holes along the intended break, inserting iron wedges, called feathers, and striking them in sequence until the stone cracks cleanly. The sound of hammers on iron rings out across the hillside through the working day. The dressed stone is carried to the building site on carts. Aberdeen granite is hard and takes a fine polish, but it is also enormously heavy. The walls of Balmoral are thick. The towers are solid. The workforce building the castle includes masons, labourers, carpenters, plumbers, and glaziers. Many of them lodge in Crathy village. Some camp nearby. The construction runs through several years. and employs a shifting population of tradesmen. The River Dee itself is always present. It runs through the middle of all this activity. It carries the timber, it powers the mill, it provides the water for the estates, it fills with salmon every autumn. The salmon fishing on Deeside is valuable. The rights belong to the landowners. The fish are taken with rod and line and also with nets at certain points on the river. The netting stations are fixed positions where the fish can be intercepted as they move upstream. The netted fish are packed in ice and sent to market. The ice comes from the ice houses on the estates. These are underground chambers insulated with straw and earth, filled with ice cut from the river and the locks in January and February. The ice keeps through the summer in these conditions, cold enough to preserve fish and game for the journey south. The ice house at Balmoral and at several other estates along the Dee is a practical and necessary piece of infrastructure. By mid-morning, the sun is on the upper slopes of the Cairngorm Plateau. The deer are moving up from the tree line toward the high ground. They graze in groups on the short grass and sedge above 800 meters. The stalker watches them from below. The peat is banked up for the night. The last of the fire's glow catches the underside of the roof timbers, and the cottage settles into its familiar dark. This is a farm town on the eastern slopes of the Cairngorms, somewhere above Bremer, around 1855. The walls are granite rubble, roughly coursed, and the mortar between the stones is a mix of lime and local clay. The roof is heather thatch, laid thick and weighted with stones along the ridge. From the outside, the building is low and long, crouching against the hillside as though it grew there. Inside, the floor is packed earth. In most cottages of this kind, there is no ceiling. The roof timbers are open above, black with years of peat smoke. The fire burns on a central hearth or in the better-built houses against the gable wall in a stone fireplace with a simple lintel. The smoke finds its way out through a hole in the thatch or drifts slowly through the fabric of the roof itself. There is no chimney pot, no flue as a townsperson would understand one. The interior is, at almost all hours, faintly smoked. The main room is called the butt end. It serves as kitchen, living space, and often sleeping room for the younger children. The other main room, the ben end, is kept for sleeping, and in wealthier croft households it sometimes serves as a parlour, though parlour is a generous word for it. Between these two rooms there is sometimes a short passage, sometimes only a wooden partition with a door. The walls inside are bare stone in the poorest houses, or limewashed in those where the tenant has managed to keep things in some order. The limewash is renewed when there is lime to spare, which is not every year. Furniture is sparse and functional. A wooden dresser stands along one wall of the butt end, holding the household's crockery. There are 2 or 3 wooden chairs or stools made from sections of tree trunk. A table occupies the center of the room, worn smooth from years of use. Beneath it, a cat sleeps. The dresser holds blue and white transfer printed pottery, the kind brought up from Aberdeen on the carrier's cart, though older households still have wooden bowls and horn spoons alongside the newer pieces. A tin lamp hangs near the fire. It burns whale oil or sometimes a tallow dip set in an iron holder called a cruisie. The light it gives is thin. Beds in the ben end are wooden box beds built into the wall or framed against it. They have a wooden front with sliding or hinged panels, and inside they are fitted with a straw-filled mattress, sometimes a chaff mattress, laid on wooden slats. Over this go woolen blankets, hand-woven in many houses, and sometimes a plaid used double as a top cover. The box bed closes off around the sleeper. This is not merely comfort, it is insulation. The nights on Upper Deeside drop hard in winter, and the closed bed holds body heat in a way that an open room cannot. Children sleep wherever there is space. In a family of 6 or 7 children, which is common, the younger ones share a box bed or are laid on a straw pallet near the fire. The older children, especially older sons, may sleep in the barn when the weather allows, or in the byre when the cattle are inside for winter. This is not considered hardship. The body heat of cattle raises the temperature of a stone byre considerably. Families have arranged themselves around their animals for centuries in this landscape, and in 1855 that arrangement still holds. The byre and the house are often under one continuous roof. The arrangement is called a longhouse, though the people living in it do not use that term. At one end of the building, separated from the living quarters by a low stone partition or sometimes just a step in the floor, the cattle stand through the winter months. There may be 2 or 3 cows, possibly a stirk or 2. They are brought inside in October and kept until late April. The smell of the animals penetrates the living end. It is not noticed particularly. It is the smell of warmth and survival, and everyone in the glen lives alongside it. The woman of the house rises first. She is up before the rest of the family, sometime around 5 or 5:30 in the morning, depending on the season. Her first task is to lift the peat from the banked fire and coax it back to flame. In Scotland, this process is called redding the fire. She uses a pair of iron tongs and a bellows made from 2 flat boards with a leather hinge, or simply blows on the embers. Once the fire is going, water is fetched. The water comes from a burn or from a spring, carried in a wooden coggy or in a cast iron pot. There is no well in the modern sense. There is a place in the burn where the water runs clean, and that is where the household draws from. Breakfast is porridge. It is almost always porridge. Oatmeal is the staple of the household, cooked in a large iron pot over the fire and stirred with a long wooden stick called a spurtle. The porridge is made from coarse oatmeal ground at the local meal mill. In Deeside in the 1850s, the mills at Ballater, Banchory, and at smaller settlements through the valley grind oatmeal from the local oat crop. The porridge is eaten with a little milk, if the cow is in milk at that time of year. There is no sugar. Salt is used instead, stirred into the pot. Each person at the table has a wooden bowl or, in more recent households, a pottery bowl from the dresser. The porridge is eaten standing up in some households, a custom that has no obvious practical reason but persists regardless. The midday meal is sometimes a continuation of breakfast. Cold porridge from the morning pot is set aside, and when it cools, it becomes solid enough to be cut in slices and fried in a little fat. This is not a recipe from a cookery book. It is just what you do when there is oatmeal and you cannot waste it. Alongside this, there may be kale brose, made from the water in which kale has been boiled, poured hot over a handful of oatmeal and stirred. Kale grows in the kailyard, the small walled or fenced garden directly behind or beside the cottage. Almost every croft has one. The kale is a hardy variety, thick-stalked, dark green, and it grows through conditions that defeat most other vegetables. The kailyard also holds some turnips, called neeps, and perhaps some cabbages. Potatoes are grown in the runrig strips or in small enclosed plots near the house. The potato arrived in Highland agriculture in the latter half of the 18th century, and by 1855 it is firmly established even in upland Deeside. A meal in the evening might be boiled potatoes eaten with buttermilk. Buttermilk is the liquid left over after churning butter from cream. It is thin and slightly sour, and it is drunk freely. Whole milk is more likely to be made into butter or kept for the youngest children. Nothing produced by the household cow is wasted in any form. Meat is not an everyday item. A family on a Deeside croft in 1855 eats meat perhaps once or twice a week, more often in autumn when an animal has been slaughtered. In November, when the cattle that cannot be wintered are killed, the household processes the carcass carefully. Some of the beef is salted and packed into a wooden barrel. The barrel stands in a corner of the butt end or in a small lean-to attached to the side of the house. Salted beef appears through the winter months as the household works through the barrel. Sheep are also kept in small numbers. A sheep killed in autumn provides mutton, and the fat from the carcass is rendered and used for cooking and for tallow dips. The fleece is kept for spinning. Fish comes up from the coast on the carrier's cart, dried or salted. Haddock, dried hard, is called spelding on Deeside and through much of Aberdeenshire. A spelding is soaked in water, then grilled or simply held over the fire on a toasting fork. It is strong in flavor and very salty, and it is eaten with potatoes or with oatcakes. Oatcakes are baked on a flat iron griddle called a girdle in Scots, which sits directly over the fire on a chain or on a trivet of iron. The oatcake mixture is oatmeal, salt, a little fat, and water. It is rolled flat and cooked until dry and firm. It keeps for days, sometimes weeks. Bread in the modern sense, wheat bread made in a loaf, is uncommon in upland Deeside in 1855. Wheat does not grow well at altitude, and the cost of bought-in wheat flour from the lowlands makes wheaten bread a rarity. Oatmeal is the grain of this country. Barley is also grown and used for berra bannocks, flat rounds cooked on the girdle from berra meal, a coarse grey flour from the old Scottish berra barley. These bannocks are denser than oatcakes, slightly sweet, and they accompany most meals where there is not oatcake to hand. The children of the household are put to work from an early age. A child of 7 or 8 is expected to herd cattle on the hill in summer, keeping them from the growing crops and from the open hillside where they might stray. The child carries a stick and a piece of oatcake for the day. This is not a formal arrangement. The child simply goes out with the cattle in the morning and comes back with them in the evening. Younger children, from about 5 upwards, gather kindling, carry water from the burn, and help with lighter tasks around the cottage. Girls learn spinning before they are 10. The spinning wheel in most Deeside cottages in this period is a small, upright wheel, sometimes called a muckle wheel for the larger type used for wool, or a smaller, horizontal treadle wheel called a Saxony wheel. Both types are in use in the 1850s, and the choice depends on what fibre is being spun. Wool from the household's own sheep is carded and spun at home. The yarn is woven into cloth either at home, if the household has a loom, or taken to a local weaver in the nearest settlement. In Glen Muick, in Glen Gahan, in the villages along Deeside, there are weavers working in the 1850s, producing cloth for local families. The clothing of the family is mostly home-produced or bought at the quarterly market in Ballater or Aboyne. Men wear a shirt of rough linen or wool, trousers made of coarse dark cloth, and a short jacket. On their feet, they wear leather brogues, if they have them, or they go barefoot in summer. The brogues are simple, undyed hide shoes, sometimes homemade, sometimes bought from a cobbler at the market. Women wear a linen shift beneath a woolen skirt and bodice. Over everything goes a large woolen shawl, which serves as coat, blanket, and wrap for a carried infant. Children's clothing is cut-down adult clothing as often as it is anything made specifically for a child. Washing clothes requires a full day. The household has no soap as we would understand it. It uses a lye made from wood ash soaked in water. The clothes are beaten clean on stones at the burn, rinsed in the running water, and spread on the heather to dry. Washing day in the better weather happens perhaps once every 3 or 4 weeks. In winter, it happens less. The same wool and linen items are worn for longer between washings. There is no particular social shame in this. Everyone's circumstances are the same. The man of the household divides his time between the croft, the laird's estate, and increasingly in the 1850s, paid labour. Royal Deeside in this decade is undergoing a transformation. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert purchased the Balmoral estate in 1852 and immediately began rebuilding the castle. The new Balmoral Castle, designed by William Smith of Aberdeen and largely directed by Prince Albert himself, was completed in 1856. The construction work drew in labour from the surrounding countryside. Men from the crofts along the Dee and its side glens walked down in the mornings to work as quarriers, masons, labourers, and carters. The granite was quarried at Invergelder, a site on the Balmoral estate itself, and carted to the building ground. A man who could handle a cart and horse might earn 2 shillings a day at this work. The croft itself still demands attention regardless of paid work. In spring, The ground must be broken with a cascrome if the terrain is too steep for a horse-drawn plough, or with a light single-furrow plough pulled by a pair of garran ponies if the land allows. The garran is the native pony of the Highlands and upland Aberdeenshire. It is small, stocky, and very strong for its size. It is used for everything: ploughing, carting peat from the peat bank, carrying deer from the hill on a pack saddle, pulling the harrow. The harrow is a wooden frame set with iron teeth, dragged across the ploughed ground to break the clods and smooth the surface for seed. Peat is the fuel of the household, and cutting it is a summer task. The peat bank is usually on the common hill above the croft. Every family has the right to a section of the bank. The peat is cut with an iron tool called a teasjaya, or a peat spade, which has a blade and a small wing at right angles to it, allowing the cutter to lift a brick of peat cleanly. The cut peats are laid out on the surface of the moor to dry. After several weeks, they are turned and then stacked in small open stacks that allow the wind through. Later in summer, they are brought down from the hill by the garran in large wicker baskets called creels slung across the pony's back and stacked against the outside wall of the cottage to dry completely before winter. A household needs a very large stack. A single fire burning through a winter on Deeside consumes more peat than a visitor from the south. The last cart has rolled down from the high ground. The drovers have settled their animals for the night. In the glens of the Cairngorms and along the Dee Valley in the 1850s, the shape of the week was felt before it was thought about. Sunday came first, in a sense. It organised everything else. The Free Church and the Church of Scotland both held congregations across the parishes of Bremer, Crathy, Ballater, Aboyne and Banchory. The two denominations had parted ways sharply in 1843, and by the 1850s many communities had two church buildings where once there had been one. A man walking to morning worship might pass the door of his neighbour, who was walking to a different building a quarter of a mile further on. The walk itself was part of the Sunday. People came on foot from farm towns and crofts scattered along the valley sides. Some came 2 miles, some came 4. Women wore their better shawls. Men put on coats that were kept folded through the week. Children were washed the night before and inspected again in the morning light. The road to the church collected people as a burn collects tributaries. At Crathy, the parish church stood close to the north bank of the Dee. The building that stands there now is Victorian and later, but in the 1850s, the older structure served the congregation. Balmoral Castle had come into royal occupation in 1848, and by 1852, the new castle was under construction. The presence of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert changed the character of Crathy Sundays in small ways. The royal family attended the same church. Tenants and estate workers sat in the same building as their sovereign. The seating was arranged by rank, as it was everywhere, but the proximity was real. The sermon was long. It was not unusual for a Church of Scotland service to last 2 hours. The minister read from the Bible, gave his address, and led the congregation in the metrical psalms. There was no organ in most of these rural kirks. The precentor stood at the front and gave the line, and the congregation followed in unison. The sound filled the stone walls and went out across the fields when the door opened. After the service, people gathered outside. This was the social moment of the week. News moved here. A birth had taken place at a farm up the glen. A man had sold cattle at the Falkirk tryst and come back with good money. A girl from Balmoral had gone into service at a house in Aberdeen. The churchyard held the names of families going back generations, and people visited the stones of their relatives before they set off home. Sunday dinner was the best meal of the week. In the farm towns of Deeside, this often meant broth made with a piece of mutton or a fowl if the household kept poultry. Oatmeal appeared at almost every meal in some form. Bearer bannocks were baked on the girdle. Potatoes had been a staple for 2 generations by this point, and they were boiled plain and eaten with salted butter or with nothing at all. The household gathered around the table, and the meal was said to be the longest sitting of the 7 days. The afternoon of Sunday was quiet by rule. The Sabbath was observed strictly in most households. Games were not played. Unnecessary work was not done. Even the carrying of water from the well was a matter of conscience for some families. Children might walk with their parents along the riverside path or sit indoors and hear Bible stories read aloud. The quiet was not oppressive in the way it might sound now. It was simply the texture of the day. By evening, there was sometimes a second service. The Free Church in particular encouraged evening worship during the summer months. The light lasted long in July and August this far north, and a congregation could fill a wooden or stone building well after 8 in the evening. The walk home in the late dusk was cool and still. The hills were pale against the sky. The cattle stood quiet in the fields. Monday was a return. The week had its own structure on farms and in the small settlements along the Dee. In the 1850s, the valley was not heavily industrialized, but it was not purely pastoral either. There were meal mills at various points along the river, grinding oats and bearer. There were sawmills. There was quarrying of granite, particularly further east toward the lower Dee. Tradesmen in the villages of Balmoral and Banchory included wrights, blacksmiths, shoemakers, and tailors. Balmoral had grown as a settlement largely because of the spa waters at Pannonish Wells, a mile or so to the southeast. The wells had drawn visitors since the late 18th century, and by the 1850s, Balmoral had something of a summer trade. People came from Aberdeen and further south to take the waters and walk in the hills. They stayed in the small hotels and lodging houses that had appeared along the main street. For local people, this brought seasonal work and a small but regular income in the summer months. The village itself was laid out on a grid, unusual for a Highland settlement of this period. The streets were straight and the plots regular. There was a church, a school, and a handful of shops selling basic goods. A draper would have sold cloth and thread and simple ready-made items. A grocer would have kept tea, sugar, tobacco, and dried goods alongside whatever local produce was brought in. The shop counter was a social place as well as a commercial one. News came in with every customer. Further west, Bremer sat at over 300 meters above sea level. It was exposed and sometimes snowbound in winter. The landscape there was open and wide. The two halves of the settlement, Castleton of Bremer and the smaller Clatchen of Auchendrine, had been distinct communities within living memory, separated by the Cluny Water. By the 1850s, they were understood as a single place, though the Cluny still ran between them and the bridge was the daily link. The gathering at Bremer was held each September. This was the Bremer Highland Gathering, one of the oldest of the Highland Games events in Scotland. It had been formalized earlier in the 19th century under the Bremer Highland Society, founded in 1817. By the 1850s, it drew visitors from across the region and attracted royal patronage. The games included throwing the hammer, tossing the caber, putting the stone, and foot racing. Piping competitions were central. Men competed in Highland dress, the belted plaid, the bonnet, the brogues. These were not simply costumes. Among the older men in the 1850s, this was still the remembered dress of their fathers. The gathering was held on a piece of flat ground near the village. Spectators stood around the edges. Stalls were set up selling food and drink. It was one of the few days in the year when large numbers of people came together in Bremer from surrounding glens. Some arrived the night before and slept in barns or under improvised cover. The atmosphere was festive in a muted, outdoor way. People ate, talked, and watched. The competition was genuine. The prizes were modest, but the reputation of a good athlete carried weight in the community. Markets were held at different points along the valley at intervals through the year. The market at Aboyne was significant. Aboyne sits roughly midway between Banchory and Ballater, and in the 1850s the village had a green at its centre. Markets there handled cattle, sheep, and horses. Farmers from the upper glens brought animals down. Dealers came up from Aberdeen. The buying and selling happened through conversation and handshakes, the same as it had for centuries, though the prices had changed with the railway reaching further into Aberdeenshire. The railway had arrived at Banchory in 1853. This changed the lower end of Deeside noticeably within a few years. Goods could move faster. Aberdeen was suddenly closer in practical terms. A farmer at Banchory could send produce to market in the city by train and have the money within days rather than weeks. Further up the valley, the change was less immediate. Ballater would not have a station until 1866. In the 1850s, the upper Dee Valley still moved at the pace of a horse. Hiring fairs were held in spring and autumn. These were called feeing markets or feein markets in the local speech. Farm servants offered themselves for hire for a 6-month term. They stood in the marketplace or on a designated street, and farmers approached them to negotiate terms. A good ploughman was sought. A reliable dairymaid was worth keeping. The wages were paid partly in kind and partly in coin. Housing came with the position, usually in a bothy or chawmer attached to the farm town. A man hired at the spring feeing market in May would begin work almost immediately and remain until Martinmas in November. The feeing markets were held at Bankery, at Aboyne, and at other points along the valley. They were also social events. People who had not seen each other since the previous term came together. Food stalls appeared. There were travelling showmen at the larger fairs, a peep show perhaps, or a man selling cheap goods from a cart. Young people used the occasion to find company. Couples who met at the feeing market and began walking out together were common enough that the pattern was part of local understanding. Travelling merchants moved through the glens. The packman or chapman had been a feature of rural Scots life for a long time. In the 1850s, he was still active in remote areas. He carried cloth, ribbons, thread, needles, small tools, and printed chapbooks in a wooden pack on his back. He arrived at a farm town unannounced, laid out his goods on the kitchen table, and conducted his business over a cup of tea. He was also a carrier of news, bringing word from the next glen, from Bremer, from Aberdeen. His arrival was noted. In some households, he was offered a meal or a place to sleep. The Episcopal Church had a presence in the region too. Episcopalianism had deep roots in Aberdeenshire going back to the post-Reformation divisions, and while the majority of the rural population attended Church of Scotland or Free Church services, there were Episcopal congregations in some of the larger settlements. At Ballater and at Bankery, Episcopal chapels served smaller but distinct communities. These congregations tended to include some of the gentry and estate families, though not exclusively. The Catholic population in the Upper Dee Valley was small but present. Some of the old families in Bremer and the surrounding glens had retained their Catholicism through the penal centuries. The mission chapel at Bremer served this community. A priest served the congregation at intervals. The Catholic calendar shaped the year differently, with its feast days and its fasting periods, its Candlemas and its Lady Day. These were quiet observances for the most part, not public in the way that the Protestant Sunday was public. New Year was the major secular holiday of the year. Christmas was not widely celebrated as a domestic occasion in Scotland at this time. It was observed in the church calendar where the Episcopal and Catholic traditions held, but in the Presbyterian households of Deeside and the Cairngorms glens, the 25th of December passed without particular notice. It was New Year, called Hogmanay, that drew people out. On the night of the 31st of December, households across the valley lit their fires and prepared for visitors. First footing was the practice. The first person to cross the threshold after midnight brought with them a piece of coal, a piece of shortbread, and sometimes a small bottle of whiskey. The coal was for warmth and good fortune. The shortbread was made in the days before, in rounds or in the traditional petticoat tails shape. Whiskey was distilled legally in the region, and also illegally in the more remote glens, where the excise men rarely reached. The passing of a dram on New Year's morning was a gesture of hospitality and of renewal. Beltane, the 1st of May, was still observed in the Cairngorms area in modified form. The great bonfires that had once blazed on the hilltops were less common by the 1850s, but the day retained its significance in farming life. It was one of the term days, the points at which rents were due, leases turned, and farm servants changed their employers. The cattle were sometimes driven out to the summer grazings around this time, moving up the hill ground to the sheilings, where the women and young people would spend the warmer months making butter and cheese. Shealing life was its own rhythm within the year. The sheilings were the high summer pastures, sometimes several miles above the permanent farm towns. Stone or turf bothies were built there, some of them very old. A woman and her daughters might spend 8 or 10 weeks at the shealing with the cattle, making dairy produce to be carried back at the end of the summer. This was separate life, away from the main household, with its own routines and its own social patterns. Neighbors from adjacent sheilings would meet in the evenings. Songs were sung. The days were long. The summer was also the time for peat cutting. The peat banks were allocated within the community, and cutting was done in May and June. The peats were cut with a specialized iron spade called a tuskar. They were laid out to dry on the surface of the bog, then stacked in small pyramids to dry further. Later in the summer, they were carried down to the homestead and built into a peat stack against the outside wall of the house. This stack would fuel the fire through the winter. The work of cutting was often communal, with neighbors helping each other in sequence. Midsummer was not marked by any major public event in the Protestant community, but the long light of June evenings had its own quality in the glens. Work could be done outdoors until 10 at night. The hayfields were at their best. The cattle on the hill ground were content. Fish moved in the Dee, and the men who had rights to fish on the various beats would be out in the evenings with their rods. Salmon were taken in considerable numbers. The fish was eaten fresh, smoked, or dried. Some was sold. The river was part of the living, not just part of the view. Martinmas fell on the 11th of November. This was the second great term day of the year. Farm servants hired at the spring feeing market were released or rehired at Martinmas. Rents were due again. The winter stores had to be in place. Animals that were not going to be overwintered were slaughtered in November, and the meat was salted down in barrels. This was called the Martinmas Mart. A household that had a cow to kill had enough beef to last well into the new year. The blood was used in black puddings. The fat was rendered. Nothing was wasted. The final weeks of November were the darkest of the year in the Cairngorms. The sun set before 4 in the afternoon. The hills above 3,000 feet were white from October onward in a normal year. The passes through the mountains were closed by snow, sometimes for weeks at a time. The Laerig Ghu, the great pass that cuts north to south through the Cairngorm Massif from Aviemore to Bremer, was impassable in deep winter. The communities on either side of the mountains were effectively separated. The valley of the Dee turned inward toward itself. The long evenings were spent at home or in the homes of neighbors. There was a tradition called the ceilidh, though the word was used in its older sense of a visiting, a gathering of neighbors in a kitchen or a barn. People brought their work. The women spun or knitted. The men might work at leather or wood. Stories were told in Scots Gaelic in the upper glens, where the language was still spoken in the 1850s, though it was retreating. Songs were sung without accompaniment, the old songs of the region, some of them very old indeed. The River Dee runs cold out of the Cairngorm Plateau. It begins near the summit of Brariach at close to 4,000 feet, where snowmelt gathers in shallow channels and moves east. By the time it reaches Bremer, the water is fast and clear, cutting through gravel beds of pale quartzite. The channel shifts a little with each winter flood. The banks are lined with alder and birch, and the roots hold the soil where they can. In the 1850s, the Dee was already a well-known salmon river. Fishing rights had been held, leased, and argued over for generations. The fish moved up from the sea in late spring and again in autumn. Gillies on the lower beats knew the pools by name. The water at Ballater ran over a broad stony bed, and the pools below the old ford were fished from first light. The landscape above Bremer was open and high. The Cairngorm Massif rose to the north and west. Ben Macdui stood at 4,296 feet, the second highest point in Britain. The plateau between the summits was largely bare. Thin soils lay over granite. In summer, montane grasses and sedges grew in the hollows, along with dwarf willow and prostrate juniper. Above 3,000 feet, the vegetation became sparse, and the ground stayed frozen late into May. The glens cutting into this high ground were not empty. Glen Louis and Glen Derry ran north from Bremer into the heart of the Massif. Along their floors, ancient Scots pine grew in scattered stands. These were remnants of the old Caledonian forest, thinning through the 18th century as timber was felled for charcoal and construction. By 1850, the pine wood at Mar was noticeably smaller than it had been in 1790. The trees that remained were old and wide. Some had trunks 3 feet across at the base. Beneath the pine, the ground was thick with heather and blaeberry. Crossbills nested in the upper branches. Red squirrels moved through the canopy. Capercaillie, reintroduced to Scotland from Sweden in 1837, were beginning to re-establish in the larger pine woods. They had been absent from Scottish forests for about 50 years before that. Their return was slow, but by the 1850s, they were recorded again in Deeside woods. The moorland above the treeline was managed for grouse. That management had intensified over the preceding 30 years. Landowners had recognized the commercial value of driven grouse shooting, and the heather was burned in rotation to encourage fresh growth. Burning took place in late winter and early spring. Strips of old heather were set alight when the ground was damp enough to prevent the fire spreading downhill. The result was a patchwork of heather at different stages of growth, visible across the hillsides in alternating bands of dark and pale. A generation earlier, around 1820, much of this same moorland had been used differently. Hill grazing for sheep and cattle had been the primary activity. Black cattle from the Highland breeds were walked down from the higher ground in autumn and sold at the great trysts at Crieff and Falkirk. The droving routes from Deeside ran south through the Cairngorms Pass and into Perthshire. In 1850, cattle still moved along these routes, but the numbers were smaller. The grouse moor had displaced some of the old grazing. The heather itself was different in character from what it had been. Decades of managed burning had produced a more uniform stand in places. The old unburned heather, where it survived, grew tall and leggy, with woody stems that could reach 4 feet. In the managed sections, the growth was shorter, denser, and more productive for red grouse. The difference was visible walking from one estate to the next. The management boundary was sometimes as sharp as a fence line. Deer forests were expanding on Deeside in the 1850s. The term referred not to actual woodland, but to high ground set aside for red deer. The process had been underway since the early decades of the century. Glen Quoich, above Bremer, had been cleared of most sheep pasture by the 1840s to allow deer numbers to rise. The deer moved between high and low ground seasonally. In summer, the stags went to the tops. By October, they came lower for the rut. The hinds stayed on the middle ground for much of the year. The Dee itself had changed somewhat between 1820 and 1850. The old wooden bridge at Bremer had been replaced. Road improvements under the influence of Thomas Telford had already altered the routes through Deeside in the 1820s. By 1850, a metalled road ran the length of Deeside from Aberdeen to Bremer. This had brought coach traffic and then carriage traffic within reach of places that had previously been half a day's ride from the nearest inn. The valley had become more accessible without becoming crowded. Below Bremer, the river moved through a broader strath. The floodplain widened near Ballater. Fields of oats and here, the old Scottish barley, spread along the lower ground. These fields were ploughed in March and April with horse-drawn ploughs. The soil here was thin but workable. Lime had been applied to fields in this area since at least the 1790s, carted up from the coast to correct the acidity. By 1850, the practice was well established. The village of Ballater itself was a planned settlement. It had been laid out in the late 18th century on the lands of the Monaltree estate. The grid of its streets was modest, a few parallel rows of stone-built houses, a central square, and a short main street. By the 1850s, it had grown to serve visitors coming for the mineral springs at Pannonish Wells, a mile to the east on the south bank of the Dee. The waters there had been drawing visitors since the 1760s. A small hotel and bathing facilities stood at the site by mid-century. Further east, the character of the landscape shifted. The moorland gave way by degrees to a more enclosed agricultural country. The parishes of Torfins, Kincardine O'Neill, and Aboyne lay on ground that had been improved through the enclosure and drainage work of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Hedge lines and stone dikes divided the fields. The old runrig system, in which strips of cultivated land were shared among tenants, had been largely swept away in this part of Aberdeenshire by 1820. The farms of the 1850s were compact, single-tenant holdings worked with hired labor. The farms kept a mix of stock. Aberdeen Angus cattle, still sometimes called Buchan Humleys in this period, were being bred with increasing care in the county. The polled black cattle were well suited to the climate and the rough keep of an Aberdeenshire farm. Sheep of the Cheviot and Blackface breeds ran on the upper ground. In the valley farms, pigs and poultry supplemented the household economy. The farmhouses were low, stone-built, and thatched in many cases, though slate was coming in on the newer steadings. The season on a Deeside farm turned around the grain harvest. Oats were cut in August and September, depending on the altitude and the year. At higher farms, the harvest could come very late. In poor years, snow fell before the crop was in. Harvest was done by hand, with scythes and sickles, and the cut grain was gathered and bound into sheaves by women and older children walking behind the cutters. The sheaves were stacked in the field to dry, then carted to the stackyard beside the farm. Threshing followed through the autumn and winter, by flail or by a horse-powered mill, if the farm was large enough to have one. A generation earlier, around 1820, the farms in this same area had been smaller and less capitalized. The improving movement had been working through Aberdeenshire since the mid-18th century, but its effects were still uneven in 1820. Some farms retained common grazing. Some townships still showed traces of the old ridge and furrow under their improved fields. By 1850, most of that older pattern had been buried under drainage schemes and receding. The landscape had been made more productive, but it had also been made more uniform. The water of the Dee was used for more than fishing and drinking. Mills stood along the lower river and along its tributaries. Corn mills ground the local oats. Walk mills, which were fulling mills for processing woven cloth, operated on several of the burns draining into the Dee. At Banchory, a small linen industry had operated in the early decades of the century. By the 1850s, it had largely faded. The textile work that remained was domestic, women spinning and weaving in their own houses rather than in any central facility. The timber trade had moved through the Dee in earlier centuries, with logs floated downriver from the Mar forests. By the 1850s, that floating was no longer a major feature of the river. The forests had been reduced to the point where there was less to send. Road transport had also made the floating less necessary on the lower reaches. But the memory of the timber trade shaped how people thought about the old forest. Older men in Bremer in the 1850s had fathers who had worked the pine woods. The Dee entered the sea at Aberdeen, joining the tidal estuary between the Torrey side to the south and the harbour works to the north. Aberdeen Harbour in the 1850s was a busy commercial port. The New North Pier, extended through the 1770s and 1780s, had been further improved in the early decades of the 19th century. By 1850, steam vessels were calling regularly alongside the older sail-powered smacks and brigs. Coal came in from the Firth of Forth ports and from the north of England. Granite went out, cut from the quarries at Rubislaw and from the surface workings at various points around the city. The fishing fleet at Aberdeen worked the North Sea grounds. The boats in the 1850s were largely open or half-decked craft, working out of the harbour and returning within the day or after 2 or 3 nights at sea. The main catch was haddock, whiting, and cod. The fish were brought ashore at the market early in the morning. Women from the fishing community, many of them from the Footdee district at the mouth of the harbour, carried the fish in creels and sold them through the streets of the city. The trade was ancient, the method largely unchanged. A generation before, around 1820, the Aberdeen harbour had been smaller and less ordered. The work of enlarging and deepening the channel had been ongoing for decades. The bar at the harbour mouth had been a persistent problem, and the scouring action of the diverted Don had been used to help shift it. By 1850, the approaches were better, and larger vessels could enter. The volume of trade had grown with the city. Aberdeen itself had about 70,000 people by the early 1850s, up from roughly 27,000 in 1801. The River Don, running north and east of Aberdeen, drained a different country. Its upper reaches above Ulford ran through a broad, sheltered valley used for dairy farming and grain. The Don moved more slowly than the Dee and flooded across a wider plain. Paper mills had been operating on the Don at Stonywood since 1770. By the 1850s, that mill was a significant employer, producing paper for commercial use. Machinery driven by the river had replaced much of the handwork that had characterized the trade earlier. Back in the higher glens, the seasonal rhythm was marked by the movement of stock between low and high ground. In May, the cattle and sheep were moved up to the hill grazings, the sheilings that had been used for summer pasture for centuries. The sheiling bothies, small stone and turf shelters, stood in clusters on the high ground above the permanent farms. Women and younger people traditionally went up with the animals and stayed for weeks at a time, making butter and cheese from the summer milk while the lower fields recovered. By the 1850s, this practice was declining on Deeside. Some sheilings had already been abandoned, the grazing absorbed into the new deer forests or left to grow over. The peat mosses on the higher ground supplied fuel for the farms and cottages below. Peat cutting took place in May and June. The turves were cut with a special spade called a tuskar, stacked to dry through the summer and carted home in autumn. A household might burn several thousand peats through a winter. The work was communal, and the rights to cut on particular sections of the moss were carefully maintained. Coal, arriving by road from Aberdeen, was beginning to supplement peat in the lower valley by the 1850s, but it was still a luxury on the higher farms. The birds of the plateau followed a pattern set long before human memory. Ptarmigan held the high rocky ground above 3,000 feet. They were white in winter, grey-brown in summer, and the change came gradually through April. Golden plover nested on the open moor from April onward. Dotterel, those small wading birds of the high tops, arrived in late May and nested on the stony ground near the summits. They moved on by late summer. In the glens, dippers worked the fast streams, walking into the current on the stone beds. The River Avon, flowing north out of the central Cairngorms to join the Spey at Ballindalloch, drained the western edge of the massif. Its upper glen, Glen Avon, was remote in the 1850s. The path to Loch Avon, that deep cold lake beneath the northern face of Ben Macdui, was known to shepherds and stalkers, but to few others. The loch sat at 2,377 feet. Its waters were among the coldest in Scotland. In hard winters, ice persisted on its surface into June. The Spey itself, receiving the Avon and a dozen other tributaries from the Cairngorm edge, was a different kind of river. Broader, faster in its middle reaches, and subject to sudden violent floods, the Spey was famous for its violence after heavy rain or rapid snowmelt. The flood of 1829, known across the north of Scotland as the Muckle Spate, had devastated the river's lower valley. Bridges had been carried away, mills had been destroyed, fields had been buried under gravel. By the 1850s, the physical evidence of that flood was still visible in the shape of the banks and in the stories people told. Timber from the Strathspey forests had been floated down the Spey in great quantities from the late 17th century onward. The York Buildings Company had worked the Mar forests early in the 18th century. Later, the Speyside forests above Grantown had supplied timber to the Navy and the building trade. The floaters who managed the timber runs lived in the riverside communities and worked the spates, guiding the logs around the bends with long poles. By the 1850s, the floating was winding down as the accessible timber grew scarcer and road transport improved. But the floaters were still living, still talking about the work, and the river still showed the marks of their craft in the worn rocks at the worst of the narrows. The moorland around Grantown-on-Spey in the 1850s was a managed landscape. The Strathspey estate of Sir James Grant, laid out from the 1760s onward, had imposed a pattern of fields and plantations on ground that had previously been open moss and heath. By the mid-19th century, those plantations had matured. The light goes first from the high tops. Cairntowl and Brariach hold a pale gold for a little while after the glens below have fallen into shadow. The ridgelines stay sharp against a sky that turns from blue to a colour closer to pewter. Then that colour fades too, and the mountains become dark shapes without detail. Down in the Dee Valley, the river still catches light. The water moves fast over the stones near Bremer, and the surface breaks into small white pieces that are visible long after the banks have gone dark. A heron stands at the edge of the shallows near the bend above Invercold. It does not move. The cold comes up off the water first, before it comes down from the hills. The workers who have been out on the higher ground begin to come in before that cold arrives. The men cutting peat on the slopes above Crathy have been at it since early morning. They carry the last of the dried blocks down in creels on their backs, heavy loads that make them lean forward on the descent. The path down is worn deep into the heather. Boots have made it over many years, and it shows. The peat cutters reach the township as the light is going. A township near Bremer in the 1850s might be a cluster of 6 or 8 low stone houses, their walls thick, their roofs thatched with heather or turf. The chimneys are not always chimneys in the formal sense. Some houses have a simple hole in the roof ridge to let the smoke out. By evening, smoke is coming from all of them. The cattle have already been brought in. In these upland townships, cattle were often wintered inside, sharing the byre end of the longhouse with the family. The arrangement kept warmth in the building through the night. The smell of the animals was simply part of the smell of home. A woman in one of these houses has milked the house cow before the last light went. The pail sits near the fire now, covered with a cloth. The fire itself is a peat fire. Peat burns differently from wood. It burns slowly and steadily, giving off a thick, dark smoke with a particular smell that anyone who has known it once will know again anywhere. The fire in a Deeside cottage in the 1850s would not have been built on a raised hearth in most cases. It sat on the floor in the center of the room or against one wall, with the smoke finding its way up and out as best it could. The floor around it is packed earth, worn smooth. A pot hangs over the fire on an iron chain. In October, that pot most likely holds brose or a thin soup made from whatever was to hand. Turnips were grown in the small rigs below the townships, kale too, and a little barley. The barley grown in Deeside in this period was the short-season variety suited to the short growing window at altitude. It was ground at the local mill, and the meal kept in a wooden chest near the wall. Brose is made simply. Oatmeal goes into a bowl, boiling water is poured over it, or boiling broth, and it is stirred with a wooden stick called a spurtle. Salt is added, sometimes a little butter if there is butter to spare. This is what the men who cut peat would eat in the evening. It is what their fathers ate and what their children would eat. It is filling and it is warm, and in a place where the winter comes early and stays late, those two things matter above most others. The women of the township have not finished their work at the end of the men's working day. A woman in a Deeside croft in the 1850s might have spent the afternoon spinning. She sits near the fire now in the dimming light, and the wheel turns. Wool from the local blackface sheep, carded and spun into yarn for knitting or weaving. The sound of the wheel is a steady hum, low and rhythmic. It does not stop when conversation starts. Knitting was often done in the dark or near enough the dark. Fingers learn the work and do not need eyes to guide them. A pair of stockings could take several evenings to complete. The stockings might be worn by the family or they might be sold. Women in Deeside townships supplemented the household income this way. A traveller passing through Bremer in the mid-19th century noted that nearly every woman he saw on the road had needles in her hands. Children in these households were put to work early. A girl of 7 or 8 would already be learning to knit. A boy of the same age might have spent the day herding cattle on the hill, keeping them from straying onto ground that was not the family's. By evening, he is back inside and likely already asleep in the corner. Children slept where they could. Beds in a Deeside longhouse were box beds built into the wall with wooden doors that could be closed. They kept the heat in and the drafts out. Outside, the Dee sounds different in the evening. During the day, there is always wind to cover it. By evening, the wind often drops, particularly in the glen bottoms, and the river becomes the loudest thing. It runs over a bed of rounded granite stones, pale grey and pale pink, and the sound is continuous and unvarying. A man walking the track beside the river at dusk would hear it clearly. He might also hear a red deer calling on the hill above. October is the rut, and the stags roar from the high corries. The deer on the Balmoral estate by the 1850s were under careful management. Prince Albert had been shooting there since the royal family first leased the old castle in 1848, and the new castle on the same estate was completed in 1856. The employment that came with the royal presence had changed some things in the valley. There were more gamekeepers. The deer forest extended further. Men who had previously grazed cattle on certain hillsides found that those hillsides were now reserved for deer. The keepers themselves had their own routines at the end of the day. A head keeper might live in a stone cottage at the edge of the estate, better built than a croft house, with a proper chimney and perhaps a wooden floor. He would be checking his traps and snares before the light finally went. Vermin control was a daily obligation on a sporting estate. Stoats, weasels, and crows all came under pressure from the keeper's hand. Pole traps stood on fence posts throughout the forest. In Bremer village itself, the evening had a different character. Bremer sits at around 340 meters above sea level, at the confluence of the Cluny Water and the Dee. In the 1850s, it was a small settlement, the principal one in Upper Deeside, with an inn, a church, a school, and a handful of trades. A blacksmith worked near the center of the village. His fire would have been damped down by now, but the forge would still be warm, and the smell of hot iron and coal smoke lingered in the air around his building. The inn at Bremer in this period served whiskey and ale to local men and to the occasional traveller. The road up Deeside had been improved following the military roads built in the 18th century, and by the 1850s, it was possible to travel by coach from Aberdeen to Bremer. The journey took most of a day. Men who arrived by coach in the evening would eat at the inn. Beef was on the table when there was beef. More often, it was mutton from the local hill flocks, boiled plain or made into a broth. Conversation in the inn would have been in Scots Gaelic for the older men and in Scots English for the younger ones. The language was shifting in Deeside through the middle decades of the 19th century. Gaelic had been the tongue of the Upper Valley for centuries. By the 1850s, it was retreating, spoken still in the households of older people, but less and less by those who had been to the parish school. The schoolmaster at Bremer taught in English. The parish church stands near the centre of Bremer. It was built in 1839 to replace an earlier structure, and in the 1850s it was a plain, rectangular building of local granite. The minister lived in the manse close by. He would be at his desk in the evening, preparing his Sunday sermon or writing in the parish register. The register recorded births, marriages, and deaths. In a township where winter was long and medical care almost entirely absent, the death rate among infants was high, and the minister's pen was busy. Away from the village, along the south side of the Dee, the road ran through birch and Scots pine. The native pinewoods of this part of Deeside had been exploited for timber for a long time. Mar Forest had supplied timber to the Jacobite army in 1715. By the 1850s, commercial felling operations were conducted on a more organized scale. Floating logs down the Dee to Aberdeen had been practiced for generations. The river was high enough in the spring to carry timber, and men worked the water drives in cold conditions. The woodcutters in the Ballachbuie and Inverry area had a long day behind them by evening. They worked with broad axes and two-handed saws. The timber came down in sections, stripped of its bark, where the pine resin made the wood valuable. The chips and bark lay in piles at the felling sites. Sawdust settled in the folds of the men's clothing. At the end of the day, their arms ached from the sawing and their backs ached from the lifting. They ate together at the bothies. A bothy in this context was a simple shelter, sometimes a permanent stone structure, sometimes a temporary lean-to of timber and turf. Men working far from the townships would sleep in the bothy through the working week and return home on a Saturday. The fire in the bothy at evening was for cooking and for warmth both, and the men sat around it on whatever seating they had brought or improvised. Conversation was quieter now than during the day. The food in the bothy was basic, oatmeal again, and perhaps dried salt fish. Herring from the Aberdeen fishing boats was salted and packed in barrels and sent inland. It was cheap enough that even men with little money could afford it. A piece of hard cheese might come from home. Tea was drunk, though tea was still a modest luxury in working households in the 1850s. Some men brought whiskey in a flask. Whiskey in Deeside in this period was both a local product and a practical necessity. Illicit distilling had been conducted in the hills above the valley for generations before the Excise Act of 1823 regularized the trade. By the 1850s, legal distilleries were operating in the region. The whiskey made in Upper Deeside used the soft, cold water from the Highland springs and the local barley. It was drunk neat and in small amounts by working men at the end of a long day. It was not a luxury. It was part of the evening. Back in the townships, the evening meal is finished. The pot has been cleaned and set aside. The fire has been built up with more peat, enough to last through the night without attention. A Deeside peat fire, properly banked, can hold a glow until morning. The woman of the house covers the embers with ash. This is called smoring the fire, and it is done with care. A fire that goes out overnight must be rebuilt from scratch in the morning, and that means either striking a spark from flint and steel or going to a neighbor for a burning ember. The sounds outside at this hour are the river and the wind and nothing else. On a clear October night in Upper Deeside, the sky overhead would have been extraordinary. There was no gas lighting in Bremer in the 1850s. There were no street lamps of any kind on the tracks through the townships. A candle in a window was the only artificial light visible across the valley. The stars above Cairn Towl on a clear night came down almost to the horizon. A man outside at this hour might pause and look up. He would see the Milky Way as a visible band across the sky. He would see individual stars with a clarity that has become unusual in later centuries. The moon, if it was up, would throw shadows sharp enough to walk by without a lantern. The granite of the high tops caught the moonlight and held it. The Upper Dee Valley at night in October 1850 was a dark and quiet place, and the dark and the quiet were complete. Inside the longhouse, the family is settling. The box beds are occupied. The cattle in the byre end shift and breathe. A dog, if the family has one, lies near the fire. In the 1850s, working dogs on a Deeside croft were collies used for gathering the cattle and the sheep. They were not kept as pets in any formal sense. They were working animals with a place near the hearth because they had earned it. The spinning wheel has stopped. The woman who was working at it has folded the wool and set the carded fleece back in the basket. She sits a moment longer by the fire before she too goes to bed. The fire has settled into a low red glow under the ash. The room is dim and warm and smells of peat smoke and animals, and the meal that was cooked earlier. Outside, the frost is beginning to form. On the higher ground above the valley, frost can come any month of the year, but in October it settles regularly and stays. The grass on the lower slopes stiffens and whitens. The puddles on the track to the peat banks develop a thin skin of ice that will crunch underfoot in the morning. Up on Bain, a Buard, above the tree line, the first real snow of autumn may already have fallen and lain. The mountain does not announce this to anyone in the valley below. The Dee moves through all of it unchanged. The river ran in this valley for thousands of years before the houses on its banks were built, and it will run after them. In the 1850s, it carried snowmelt in spring and peat-stained spate water in autumn. It ran clear in summer over its pink and grey granite bed. At night in October, it ran dark and fast, and its sound was the constant background to everything else that happened in the valley. Men who lived beside it all their lives would not have noticed it particularly. It was simply there, as the hills were there, as the cold was there, as the long winter coming was simply there and not to be remarked upon. The last light in the village of Bremer goes out sometime around 9 in the evening. The inn stays open a little longer. The voices of the men inside carry in the cold air further than they would in summer. A figure crosses the small square in front of the church, moving quickly in the cold, and is. The last light leaves the sky somewhere above Lochnagar around 9 in the evening in August. It goes slowly, the blue draining out from the west, while the plateau stays pale for another half hour. By 10, the hill is dark. There are no lamps up there. There is no one up there, not at that hour, not in that years. Down in the Dee Valley, the darkness is a different thing. It has texture to it. The river catches what little light remains and holds it in long, shallow ripples. The water is cold even in summer. It runs fast over the granite gravel beds between Bremer and Ballater, and the sound of it carries far on a still night. A man lying in his bed in a cottage near Crathy can hear the Dee moving in the dark without seeing it. The cottages along Deeside in the 1850s are mostly single-story buildings. They sit low against the ground. Their walls are thick, built from local granite rubble, and the roofs are often still thatched with heather or divot, though slate is beginning to come in by this decade, brought up from Aberdeenshire lowlands. The windows are small. A candle or a cruisy lamp burning inside does not throw much light outward. Walking past one of these cottages after dark, you might see a faint yellow glow at the edge of a shutter, nothing more. The cruisy lamp burns fish oil or whale oil. It sits on an iron stand or hangs from a nail beside the hearth. The light it gives is enough to see by at close range, enough to finish mending a net or tying a bootlace before bed. It smells of rendered fat and smoke. By the 1850s, some households in the valley are using paraffin, which came into wider use in Scotland after James Young began refining shale oil at his West Lothian works in 1850. But paraffin is still new and still expensive in the upper Dee Valley. Most households stick to what they know. The peat fire does not go out at night. It is banked before the family sleeps, the glowing turves covered with ash to hold the heat until morning. The ash keeps out the air and slows the burn. This is called smoring the fire. A well-smored peat fire can hold its heat for 8 hours or more. In the morning, the ash is scraped back, and the turf breathes red again. This matters because finding dry kindling in the Cairngorm foothills is not always easy, and a fire relit from its own embers saves both time and effort. The peat itself comes from the high ground above the valley farms. The cutting is done in May and June. Men work the peat banks with a tool called a tuskar, which has a flat iron blade set at an angle to cut the turves cleanly. The turves are laid out to dry on the moor surface for several weeks, then stacked in small open-sided piles called rickles to finish drying through July. By August, they are carried down and built into large stacks against the cottage gable end. That stack is what keeps a family warm through the Cairngorm winter. In December, the temperature at Bremer regularly falls below -10 degrees Celsius. In January 1855, it reached -27, the lowest recorded temperature in the British Isles at that time. After dark in the village of Bremer, which sits at just over 330 meters above sea level, the air in October is already cold enough to see your breath. The village in the 1850s is a small cluster of buildings on both sides of the Cluny Water, where it meets the Dee. There is a church, a few inns, a handful of tradesmen's houses, and the cottages of farm workers and gamekeepers. The Invercalled Arms stands near the centre, a posting in that handles the coaches coming up from Aberdeen on the military road. The last coach of the day arrives around 6 in the evening if the road is clear. After the coach arrives and the horses are stabled, the inn settles. The ostler checks the horses a final time around 9. He carries a lantern into the stable, an iron-framed box lantern with a tallow candle inside. The horses shift and breathe. One of them may stamp once on the stone floor. The straw on the floor is damp at the edges where the horses have stood in it all day. The smell is strong, horse sweat, manure, hay, the particular warm heaviness of large animals in an enclosed space at night. The lantern goes out and the stable door is latched. Outside on the road, there is nothing moving. The military road that runs through Bremer was built in the 1750s by troops under the direction of Major William Caulfield, who continued the road-building program begun by General Wade after the Jacobite Rising of 1715. By the 1850s, it is more than a century old. Its surface is compacted stone and gravel, rutted by cart wheels, soft at the edges where rain has undermined the verges. At night, it is simply a pale line between darker grass. There are no street lamps in Bremer in this decade, none at all. Balmoral Castle, the old castle, stands a few miles east of Bremer at this time. The new castle is being built. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert first leased the Balmoral estate in 1848, and Albert began planning the new granite building in 1852. The foundation stone was laid on the 28th of September 1853. In the mid-1850s, the construction work is ongoing. Masons and labourers are working on the site through the building season, which runs from spring through autumn. At night, the site is quiet and still. The scaffolding poles stand dark against the sky. The cut granite blocks are stacked in rows, pale and squared, each one heavy enough to require 2 men to lift. They come from the Glen quarry, about 2 miles to the south, hauled by horse and cart. The estate workers on Balmoral sleep in farm cottages or in tied housing near the home farm. The home farm at Balmoral is northeast of the castle site, on lower ground near the river. There are cattle there, Aberdeen Angus crosses and Shorthorn crosses, bred for beef. In the 1850s, the Aberdeen Angus breed is not yet fully fixed. William Maccombie of Tilifer, a few miles west of Alford in Aberdeenshire, is the man who will do most to establish the breed in the second half of the century. But in the 1850s, the cattle in Upper Deeside are a working mix. They stand in their byres at night, breathing quietly, their breath visible in the cold air as faint clouds. The byre walls hold the warmth of their bodies. A byre in October is warmer inside than outside by several degrees. The sheep on the hillsides above the valley are not brought in at night. They are black-faced sheep, a hardy breed suited to the exposed ground above the tree line. In the 1850s, the Cairngorm hillsides above Bremer carry large numbers of sheep, particularly on the southern and eastern slopes, where the grass holds into late autumn. The sheep on the open hill at night are invisible unless the moon is up. Their presence is given away by the faint tearing sound of grazing and by the occasional soft sound they make when moving. A shepherd knows his flock by these sounds. He can tell from the tone of their movement whether something has disturbed them. The deer are another matter. Red deer are abundant in the Cairngorms in the 1850s. The fashion for deer forest management is taking hold at exactly this time. Landowners are converting sheep ground back to deer ground, partly for sport and partly because Victorian sporting culture has made deer stalking fashionable. The royal family's presence at Balmoral from 1848 onward accelerates this. By the mid-1850s, the ground north and west of Bremer carries significant deer numbers. At night, the stags are moving. In September and October, it is the rut. The roaring of red deer stags at night in the Upper Dee Valley is one of the defining sounds of that season. It carries across the corries from Bain, a Buard, to the Cairnwell. It is a deep, rough bellowing sound, repeated at intervals, answered from far away by other stags. A man who has not heard it before might not know what it is. The gamekeepers on the Invercold and Balmoral estates are out at first light and sometimes after dark. They carry percussion cap rifles or single-barreled shotguns. The percussion cap system replaced the flintlock in general sporting use in Scotland during the 1820s and 1830s, and by the 1850s, breech-loading guns are beginning to appear, though muzzle loaders are still common. The keeper's main work is not shooting. It is moving through the ground, knowing where the deer are, setting and checking traps for foxes and wildcats and pine martens, which are all considered vermin on a sporting estate in this era. The wildcat is still present in the Cairngorms in the 1850s. So is the osprey, though it will be shot out of the area before the end of the century. At night, the keeper is usually indoors. His work is done by day and by the edges of day. The River Dee at night in August runs clear. It is one of the clearest rivers in Scotland, fed by the granite plateau of the Cairngorm Massif, where there is very little peat to colour the water. After heavy rain, it runs a pale brownish tint for a day or two, then clears again. The water temperature at Bremer in August is around 9 or 10 degrees Celsius. Atlantic salmon are in the river in August, running upstream toward their spawning grounds. They move at night as well as day. In the pools below Bremer, at places like the Linn of Dee 6 miles upstream, the fish lie still in the deep water. The Linn of Dee is a narrow gorge where the river forces itself through a gap in the rock, no wider than 2 meters in places. The sound there at night is continuous and loud, a roaring and churning that can be heard from the road above. Poaching is common on Deeside in the 1850s. The salmon and the deer both attract men who have no legal right to take them. Salmon poaching is done at night, by torchlight or by moonlight, using a leister, which is a multi-pronged iron spear. A man stands in the shallows or on a flat rock above a pool and strikes down at the fish below. The torchlight attracts the fish to the surface. This is called burning the water, and it has been practiced in Scotland for centuries. It is illegal under the Salmon Fisheries, Scotland, Act of 1828, and gamekeepers and water bailiffs watch for it. but on a dark bend of the Dee in October, it is easy enough to work quietly and be gone before anyone comes. The farms in the valley bottom are growing oats and turnips in the 1850s. Oats are the staple cereal crop of upland Aberdeenshire. They tolerate the short growing season and the heavy acid soils better than wheat or barley. The oats are cut in September with a scythe or, on larger farms, with an early mechanical reaper. Bell's reaping machine, developed by Patrick Bell of Angus in 1828, was widely adopted in the Scottish lowlands through the 1830s and 1840s, and is reaching the larger farms of Deeside by the 1850s. Smaller crofts still cut by hand. After cutting, the sheaves are stooked in the field to dry, then carted to the stackyard beside the farm buildings. At night in late September, the stackyards along Deeside are full. The stacks are built carefully, each one thatched with a cap of straw and tied down against wind. The turnip fields are still standing in October. Turnips, specifically the Swede turnip or neep, are grown as winter feed for the cattle. They are sown in June in rows, singled by hand in July, a slow crouching work done by women and children as well as men. By October, the roots are large and solid, sitting half out of the ground, their skin rough and purplish green. They will be lifted through November and stored in pits, covered with earth and straw, or fed directly to the cattle in the field. At night in October, the turnip field is a dark expanse of large round shapes in regular lines, catching the moonlight if there is any. The moon over the Cairngorms rises late in October. When it is full and the sky is clear, which is not often because this is one of the wettest mountain regions in Britain, the plateau above 2,000 feet catches the light and holds it. The summits of Cairn Towel and Brariach and Ben Macdui are pale shapes against a dark sky. There is no snow on them yet in early October, but by the end of the month, the first dustings appear on the plateau. The snow can come in any month on the Cairngorm tops. There are places in the northern corries, particularly in the corrie below Cairnlocken, where snow patches survive most summers and some years never melt at all. Below in the valley, the October night is windless more often than not. The Dee Valley is sheltered. The hills on both sides, the Mount to the south and the Forest of Mar to the north, block the prevailing westerlies. Sound travels well in this stillness. The bark of a dog from a farm half a mile away comes clearly across the dark fields. The dog has heard or scented something, a fox perhaps moving along the edge of the root field, or a deer coming down from the hill to graze the lower ground at night, as they sometimes